Introduction of the Grimm 13. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ben Tucker. The Grimm 13. Introduction by Edward J. O'Brien. There were 6 of us gathered around the fire that evening, and we were talking about short stories as they are published in American magazines. 3 of us wrote short stories ourselves, and the most absorbing interest of 2 others was the critical study of the American short story. The 6th member of our circle was in a class apart. He sometimes published the short stories we had written and criticized. As we chatted away more or less idly, we reformed most of the magazines of our acquaintance, and dismissed more than one momentous question of national policy with a phrase. Suddenly one of us who writes stories himself put the question half seriously. If Poe were living today, would the American magazines publish his stories? We wondered, a bit lazily perhaps. It was the general opinion that they would not. And then, as we began to speculate, the subject took on a certain human interest, and we were roused to question among ourselves as to what the reasons could be for this undeniable fact. Some of us thought that it was due to altered critical standards. Others ascribed it to the influence of O. Henry. But after some discussion, it seemed clear to us all that there was a taboo against grim or gruesome stories in editorial circles, and that American editors believed the public demanded the happy ending. We began to call a roll of American storytellers, and as name after name was mentioned, the question arose in our minds as to whether or not every storyteller might not have one story in his private drawer, which no magazine would agree to publish because of its gruesome character. The conviction grew among us that a grim story, no matter whether it was a literary masterpiece or not, was hoodooed. And then the inspiration came. Why not try to find 13 hoodooed masterpieces by 13 unlucky masters, and throw them upon the mercies of the public for a vote? No sooner suggested than done. Storytellers, critics, and publisher for once were agreed. If there were 13 unlucky stories in America good enough to print in a book, we would find them and publish them with our appeal for judgment. So, here they are. It is too soon to value them except by relative standards, but I must confess that many of them seem to have an assured quality that belongs to literature. For several years it has been my province to read critically the great mass of short stories published in America, with a view to gathering the best of them into more permanent form than a magazine can offer. I have found many stories of conspicuous excellence in these years, but taking into consideration the average quality of these 13 grim stories, I am impressed more than ever with the fact that many of the best stories written in England and the United States today find it impossible to achieve publication in American magazines. In the selection of these 13 stories, the first condition which each story had to meet was that of repeated rejection by American magazines. The 13 stories which you are about to read have been tabooed by American editors, because they believe you do not like realism or unhappy romance. The great literary periods have been characteristically tolerant in the free imaginative play permitted to writers by the general public. Wherever you find a period in which literary achievement has been compelled by general opinion to follow prescribed paths, you will find an unimaginative formalism and an arid technical excellence. On the other hand, wherever you find a generation eager and curious in its study of human nature, tolerant toward innovation, and open-minded with regard to the literary production of its writers, you find also an alert criticism of life and a richly human art flourishing and spreading widely into other countries. Now, the characteristic contribution of America to literature is the short story. We are specially responsive to the art of the short story writer, even when we are least critical of his achievement. During the generation, which is just coming to a close, the public for short stories has grown so rapidly that it is now practically coextensive with the population of the country. Never before in history have the commercial rewards been greater, and never, alas, before have these rewards had so decisive an influence in dictating the matter and manner of the American short story. Under these circumstances, it behooves every American writer to search deeply in his heart for the assurance that his creative work is the sincere and uninfluenced expression of what he most desires to say. It is specially necessary that he should not permit himself to compromise his standards by yielding to the pressure of high commercial rewards, when these rewards imply a molding influence upon his literary work. This book seeks to remove, or at least to define clearly, one taboo. It proves that 13 writers have found that some of their finest imaginative work could not achieve magazine publication without sensible modification. I think that these stories, one and all, prove that much fine and sincere work is lost every year to America by reason of these restrictions. For example, The Abigail Sheriff Memorial by Vincent O'Sullivan is as fine a story as that author has given us in any of his volumes. Mr. O'Sullivan is regarded in Europe as one of the 5 recent American writers of fiction whose work measures up to European standards of novel writing. Yet, his masterly psychological acumen, because it lacks sentimental flabbiness, debars him from American magazines. Such a story as this challenges the intellect, and intellectual pleasure is not the chief end sought in the American short story of the present day. Some years ago, Miss Alice Brown published a story called The Master. It dealt with the personality of a great American writer who had given up the social pleasures of a city to retire to a remote island and give the world the imaginative fruit of his social observation. Many other writers were gathered at dinner and spoke of him, and editors who were there confessed that they could not often afford to print his stories because of their subtle craftsmanship. But when the old man came into their midst and sat among them, suddenly they all knew that he was their master, to whom they owed the allegiance of a previously unconscious discipleship. When I read Mr. O'Sullivan's story, I thought of this, and I wondered how many hidden masters America might have, if we were only more hospitable to their sincerity. I do not know whether the master whom Miss Brown had in mind was Henry James, but it seems to me that this expatriated American, whom America refuses to appreciate, is likely to become his most logical successor. Hardly second to it in fine human quality is Old Fags by Stacy Ammonier. The managing editor of one of the oldest and most conservative of America's literary periodicals confessed to me that this was the finest story, in his opinion, that his magazine had received during 1916, yet he did not publish it. 2 other editors of magazines with national reputations, justly earned, also told me that they regarded it as impossible to publish because of the offense it would give their readers. I state these facts frankly in order that the public may judge for itself how far these editors have mirrored its desires. When The Black Pool by Frederick Stewart Green was first called to my attention, I was amazed to find that a story whose plot was so original and whose inevitable unfolding was depicted with such power should have been consistently rejected by magazine editors because of its unhappy ending. Now, I do not claim that all of these 13 stories are permanent additions to contemporary literature. I am sure that 5 or 6 of them rank with the best that our writers have yet produced. But whether or not the others will be remembered 20 years from now, one thing is certain, and that is that there is no story in this volume which does not merit serious critical attention and challenging interest from the general reading public. I regard this book, therefore, as the most valuable proof that can be afforded of the fact that American literature demands tolerant fostering. It would be a serious, and perhaps a fatal thing if such talents as these were denied expression because our mood was lazy and our hearts sentimental. Besides, to any reader whose mind is not sunk too far in the drowsy listlessness of narcotic fiction, these stories are a bracing imaginative summons. They give life new values and transmute old values into a new currency of our own realm. End of introduction by Edward J. O'Brien. Section 1 of the Grim 13. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. The Day of Dehemus by Vance Thompson. This collection of stories is started with Mr. Thompson's Day of Dehemus because, to our mind, it sounds the pitch for the volume. We believe the vivid characterization and the craftsmanship shown in handling the theme will give pleasure to all who appreciate tales written because the author felt an urge to write them, and not because he strove only to turn out something that would surely sell. Like all the stories here set down, it has been rejected with praise by many magazines. The Day of Dehemus. It is not strange these things happened. Everything happens. What is strange is that they were not hid. They were done in open day, and even now the trail of them lies plain and discernible over the streets and avenues of the city. Murders have been done in ways so dark there was no uncovering them. Mole murders, they crept so quietly underground there was neither heave nor ripple of the turf to mark their way. These crimes were successful because they were done in the dark. The bullet flew with none to note its flight. The poison struck, and none knew whence it came. The murderer got his vengeance, and found him safety, because he worked alone and in secret, with no witness and no accomplice. In just such a way, for instance, Père Vanille was killed in that obscure room in the Boulevard Voltaire, pulled down by a vengeance that had hunted him from Tahiti and the southern seas. It was a crime of mystery. There was nothing but darkness, and through it a flash of murder. Now the murder of Dehimas was mysterious because it was openly done, with public discussion and doctors and lawyer at the bedside. It was mysterious, I repeat, because it was done in a blaze of light. It was as though the murderer had hid himself in light so dazzling he could not be seen, as though his crime were based on the crowd of witnesses he drew about him. He could not have gone more frankly about his business of revenge and murder if he had brought Dehimas down Broadway in a gilt wagon drawn by 6 piebald horses, with outriders and a brass band leading the way, and a police parade following. And just because it was so public, it was mysterious as the arrow that flies by night. Which is a strange thing. In this account of the death of Dehimas, I shall not begin with the murder and travel back to the initial cause thereof. It is better to make a beginning the day David Rinich was carried out of the Dehimas brewery, his little leg pulped and broken. David was 6 years old, possibly 7. Pride was on him that day. For the first time, and also for the last, he carried a tin pail containing his father's dinner down to the engine room in the brewery. Being a small, alert boy, his black eyes quick with curiosity, he prowled into a danger zone and was caught in what interlocking play of steel I know not, and was rescued with a right leg hideously smashed. Now of this small and broken David it is probable Dehimas never heard. Fat and blond and huge and happy, the Dehimas rolled through the kind of society such a man can find, seeking food and drink and laughter, and the brewery was merely the hereditary source of the money he wallowed in. Not to him would come word or wail of the young David, carted away to the hospital. Had he heard of it, he would have been moved to tears and violent outbursts of generosity. But of that trivial accident he never heard, and of course he was in no way responsible for it, no more than the wind that blew a color into his fat and smiling face as he waddled that midday to his club. Had Dehimas been a far-seeing man... Do you remember Holbein's Dance of Death at Basel? Cardinals and princes, merchants and beggars, women, children, and as they dance, each is seized upon by his own death, which is a grim and capering skeleton. Had Dehimas been a far-seeing man, the day little David was caught in the interlocking play of steel in the brewery, he would have discerned a capering figure, still a long way off, that started up and moved toward him, a lean piper blowing a tibia, his own death. But Dehimas, as he waddled clubward, was thinking of other things. 3 months later, David was taken back to his home with a shortened right leg that could not be made straight and which bent out at the knee, sideways, and was twisted in at the ankle. He was carried up 4 pair of stairs, for his home was in a tenement, built of shrewishly clean bricks and steel that fronted the East River and had a view of Blackwell's Island. For modernized poverty had preempted one of the fairest sights in New York City. David was put in a chair, with another chair as a rest for his stiff and crooked leg, and his mother crooned over him. She was a little dark-visaged woman, who wore a wig made of brown flax, a dreadful, flagrant thing, such as the women of the Polish and Galician Jews of those parts put on with marriage. But Mrs. Rinich was not a Hebrew woman. She belonged to an obscurer and more tragic race. So far as she knew, she was a gypsy. Somewhere kindly Jews had found her, a waif child in the streets, and given her food, home, nurture, religion. In due season they had married her to old Rinich. After 10 years of married life there was no beauty in her, for she was wrinkled like an old woman, and her teeth were broken and black, but there was something better than beauty in her as she crooned over her little son. She was radiant with mother love. It was only for this whelp of her tiger breed she softened. And the whelp, stretched on the blanketed chairs, looked up at her with terror and adoration. It was the look you have seen in the eyes of a dog when it seeks godhead in a human face. It was evident that both his fear and his love pleased the woman. She stroked his head and kissed him and smiled. Then she went to the table and poured him out a cup of coffee. The child had been weaned on coffee. It was cold, for it had stood a long time. It was dark and full of dregs. She fixed her black eyes on him as he took the cup. "Is it good?" she asked. "Is it warm? Is it sweet for my little son?" "It's cold and bitter," said the child timidly. She blew her breath on the coffee, and little David, staring, saw it bubble and fume with heat. It whitened under her breath, as though with milk, and when he tasted the hot liquid it was honey-sweet. "Now it is sweet and hot," he said, and drank it slowly. His mother laughed and sat with her arm round him, crooning. So old Renich found them when he came in. All had not gone well with old Renich since the accident. With east-side promptitude he had demanded compensation for David's injury. With unanswerable logic the brewery folk replied that David had no business in the engine room, no justifiable interest in the interlocking play of steel, and that not a penny of compensation would be paid. Old Renich might have been content, but the mother was of harder metal. Many and curious were the curses she laid upon Dehimas, rolling harmlessly in his social world of beer, curses multiple, awful, unprintable. She questioned the god of things that are to come to pass, blowing feathers and reading the scroll of the coffee grounds. And always she found a fortune of money. At last she made the test that does not fail. She broke an egg into a plate, and dashed boiling water on it, and lo, in lines and curves the yolk and albumen streamed toward her left hand, not her right, promising white silver and yellow gold. Thereupon old Renich, having thriftily eaten the prophetic egg, went out and hired a lawyer. It was sending good money after a bad leg. The case was hopelessly lost. Thereupon the brewery, the principle of the thing being safe, made the Reniches a present of $200. It was not enough, or it was too much. It took old Renich on a wandering career of drink from which it was not in his destiny to return. By this time, a year was gone by, little David was able to get about freely with that strange gait, half crawl and half hop, which was to be his way of going through life. The home was still in the high tenement overlooking the river. The mother saw to it they had fire and fuel. There was no lack of money, for now she told the weird fortunes that are in the coffee grounds, and the feathers, and the egg on the plate, for those who could pay for knowledge of the things that are to come to pass. There were many of these folk, and the name of the old woman, for she looked old, was famous as far as 3rd Avenue. She called herself Zakwa. Moreover, she promised to heal mysteriously the diseases of that wretched world that lay about her. She used a few drugs and herbs, but in the main she depended upon dark and uncouth mummeries that were far more effective. Often she laughed in derision as her dupes went away happy. Then suddenly she would start and tremble lest she had offended the powers. The dupester was also her own dupe. David, silent in the corner, saw and heard many strange things. You can see him sitting there, if you will, a diminutive lad of 9 or 10 or 11, for the years made little change. He was beautiful in an uncanny way, like some dark and deformed flower. His face was narrow and pale and almost perfect in contour, and the black eyes that looked out of it were bright with intelligence. They gleamed with it. His long white hands were fashioned to wear rings and hold a scepter. He should have been a king's son on some perfumed edge of the Orient, and he crouched there in a tenement while his old mother, withering more and more into a hag, whispered and cursed. The curses were for Dehimas, but it was into the heart of her little son she poured them, that they might bear fruit. Almost always David was silent. To his mother he gave only the answers she wished to hear. He would sit for hours, his dark eyes fixed on her, watching every movement of her hands, every grimace of her face as she played her cheating games of sorcery and healing, herself at last her greatest dupe. She healed and wondered at her healing. She feared her own witchcraft, though she knew her own cunning had made it. And David sat there, his delicate hands folded, his pallid, pure face bent forward like some unhappy little prince who had been caught by a hag and carried away to her garret. When the clients were gone, she held him to her poor old breasts, stroking his head and laying love on him. It was at such times she crooned murder into his ear. The name of Dehimas worked in him like a spell. At night, when she put him in bed, she kissed his warped and twisted leg and whispered that name. With it she woke him in the morning. Had not all her ills, the crooked leg of her son and the drink-harried death of her husband and her dangerous trade with its fears and penalties, come from Dehimas? And that foolish, harmless man? 3 or 4 times a year Dehimas rolled up to his brewery in a purple motor car, a fresh-colored, smiling, huge man, overfed and underhealthed. He had no regular time for coming. He came upon impulse when the fancy touched him. But in some unclean way, warned by the feathers or the clotted egg, old Zakwa knew when he would come. Always she was in the street to see him pass. Always at her side stood little David, white and silent, his great eyes blazing blackly at the man who was even then his victim. Then home again to the tenement, and the coffee that bubbled, and the clients bargaining for hope or health, and the litany of curses for Dehemus. David had no companions. He could neither run nor play. In time, later than other boys, he was unearthed by an inspector and taken to school. He found a delight in his studies. The man's brain and his little body hungered for the food of thought. One of his teachers called him a prodigy. It was as though he were not learning and acquiring things. It was as though he were remembering, with amazing rapidity, an old familiar store of knowledge. There was no effort. He did not study. He steadied himself and remembered, so his teacher said. "He shall be a great man," she predicted. She patted his curls, for she loved the sad and gentle lad. He became a great man, but not in the way she thought. Zakwa's room was filled daily with disease-riddled folk. Perhaps this was the reason David became a target for disease. When fever-stricken patients came to her, he too burned with fever, until she conjured it away. He had many illnesses. Possibly they were not real, mere phantom illnesses that played with the sensitive child. They may have been old Zakwa's experiments, but one of them cannot be explained that way. It was a disease that fastened a fungus growth in his throat one night. That day they had seen, as often before, Dehemus roll by in the big motor car, but he was a shrunken Dehemus, with a new look of cowardice in his kindly face. Old Zakwa had stared at him with set, clairvoyant eyes for the few minutes his car had been halted at the street crossing. When he was borne out of sight, she caught her son's arm and laughed, and that night the foul thing blossomed poisonously in David's throat. This disease was real enough. It nearly put an end to the lad's life, and her vengeance. For a moment, too, the lean Death, capering toward the unconscious Dehemus, checked and paused irresolute. Old Zakwa battled for days and nights, now brewing herbs, now invoking the powers. Once the room half dark with wintry day, David seemed to be dying on the bed, a little tortured, twisted figure with gaping throat. For a long while his mother stood over him motionless. Then without haste, calmly, she went to her incantations. She lighted some inflammable liquid, perhaps alcohol, in a tin plate on the table. She fanned the flames with her hands and with her breath, whispering hoarsely in words older than the Sphinx, the spells over her race. Hour after hour she called upon the gods of the things that must not be. Her voice sank to a monotone. The passion went out of it. She became steady, serene, compelling, a dark hag commanding the flames. Suddenly she laughed aloud and went over and opened the door. A young woman in a raincoat, wet with melting snow, came in diffidently. "Does little David Rennich live here?" she asked. "He is living here," said Zakwa, and she pointed to the dying lad in the bed. "Oh, poor David!" the young woman cried and went quickly to the bed and knelt. She was the schoolteacher who predicted David would be a great man, perhaps because she loved him. A woman sweet without witchcraft, swiftly competent as women are in the face of death. Within an hour she had him taken to a great hospital. Zakwa neither hindered nor thanked her. It was Dr. Gage himself, the great throat specialist, who operated on the boy. "He will do well enough for a while," Dr. Gage told the school teacher, who had come after her work for word with him. "But there is nothing can stop it. Nothing we know. Another operation, and then death will come, but not as soon as he wishes. How old is he? It's very sad." Still, for the time being, David was saved from the fell disease. He came out of the hospital taller, but still very small for his years. What was strangest was that his voice had wholly changed. It had been a soft and veiled voice. Now it was hard, a voice of metal, dominant and clear. He left the hospital, hobbling at the side of the young schoolteacher, and talking to her in that new strange voice. He was full of gratitude, and spoke to her without shyness like a man. She smiled a little sadly, for the child she had loved was gone. Then school again. And now came the day which picked up the threads of his life and knitted them to the thing he was to do in this world. What Dr. Gage had said came true. Homecoming one day, David pushed his mother away when she would have kissed him and pointed to his throat. The foul thing had come back, savager and more vicious than before. David threw himself down on the bed and lay there silent, his hands clenched over his head. It may be that in those school days other ambitions than that of murder had come to him, dreams of the fair things of youth, and now he realized that death was on them, and on him. So he lay there, this little prince who had been stolen away from his destiny and tempered and edged for murder. Old Zakwa bent over him and whispered, "You will sleep, my son." "I cannot sleep," he whispered. She laid her hands on his temples, and he slept. In an hour she woke him. "Now we shall go to the hospital," she said, and got him his hat. The great hospital that dominates that part of the east side was not far, and they went afoot. No one stopped them at the door. No one questioned them as they went up in the hospital lift. They went straight and unhindered to the room where Dr. Gage stood washing his hands after his day's work, his white blouse cast aside. The great man recognized David at once, and pain came into his look. "So soon," he exclaimed. "What do you expect me to do now? You must make an appointment. This is not right." David's tragic eyes hurt him. He hid his sympathy in brusque impatience. "Just look at his throat, doctor," the mother begged. "Just to see if it is bad. A little minute, doctor." David did not speak. "Well, come here." Dr. Gage turned on a reflecting light and made a swift examination. "You must make an appointment as soon as you can. I will speak about it myself. It is very irregular, your coming here like this. There, I'll do what I can." Dr. Gage was a tender-hearted man, and in addition David had impressed him in a singular way. The black, hopeless eyes seemed to hold him. "Is it very bad?" the old woman asked. "Is it as bad as it can be? Is it so bad it cannot be cured?" "I will do what I can," he said. The eagerness did not die out of Zakwa's face as she led her son homeward through the noisy avenue. It was there when they reached their room on the 4th floor of the tenement, and it remained while she helped him into his bed. David saw it, and fear struck at his heart, but he dared not speak. "Lie still," his mother said, "but do not sleep." He watched her through half-closed eyes. He heard her call upon her gods with all the mummery she did not believe in but feared, and then she wakened the flames in the tin plate on the table and blackened them with incense. Soon the room was thick with fumes, and in the fumes David gasped and sickened. The old woman went to and fro busily, always chirping and whispering to her gods. Slowly the incense clouds faded, and she fed the flames on the plate with fiery spirits, and they leaped up again. David saw that she was holding in the flames a little copper pot with a handle, a sort of ladle half filled with some reddish fluid that seethed and stank. She held it there a long time, her hand wrapped in her up-gathered skirt as a shield against the heat. Seen in that dancing light, she was gruesome and unreal. The flax wig was askew, disclosing wisps of gray hair. Her eyes were rimmed with red, and water dripped from them. Her half-opened mouth showed the broken and discolored teeth. At last she poured the awful decoction into a cup and carried it to the bedside. David had not moved. She crouched down by the bed and drew him to her, turning his head over on her knee and opening his mouth with her fingers as though it were a baby's mouth. Then, slowly, she let the reddish fluid drip into his throat. After a few drops had entered his throat, he gasped and choked, but she held his mouth shut. Again she let the fluid drip into his mouth, and again. Only when the ladle was empty did she place his head back on the pillow. Then she went to the table and kneeled there, whispering to the dying flames. For hours she did not move. Now the thing is absurd and impossible, but it is an exact fact that when David stood up, just as day broke, his throat was clear. It was cleaner than it had been after the surgeon's knife delved in it. There was neither rawness in it nor pain. It was the throat of a hale man who had never known blight nor disease, and the voice had come back with a new and harder ring of metal in it. These are facts. They are set down here without emphasis or exaggeration. You may attribute that cure, which Dr. Gage himself could not make, to the old woman's wizardry, or to what chance you please. The compelling fact is that David was healed. There are, as you have seen, 3 important people in this story. Dehemus, who floated like a porpoise in a certain kind of society, the old woman, who laid her curse on him, and David. But there are other people, tools of destiny, who come and go in the story. Of these, witnesses of the murder or accomplices, the chief is Dr. Gage, who had been brought into it by the selfless charity of a little schoolteacher in a draggled raincoat. And the story has reached Dr. Gage's house. It is a wide, tall house of brownstone in Lower Fifth Avenue. What had once been a spacious salon was now his reception room. Behind it were his offices and a private operating table. Dr. Gage was a youngish man of 50, loose-jointed, rather soft, with too much fat, but quick and energetic, a nervous, talkative man full of gestures. World-famous, he was one of the great surgeons of the day, a man of science with a dangerous, eccentric touch of genius in him. This was, and is, Dr. Robert Escalon Gage. For many weeks past, one of his patients had been Dehemus. A changed Dehemus. He was older, thinner, and the redness had gone out of his cheeks. In his blue, bulbous eyes was a look of pain and fear. That huge throat down which he had fed such royal food, down which he had poured a flood tide of burning drink, had rebelled. He rooted no more in the trough of life. All that lay in a dubious past. He was fighting for mere existence. Gladly he had given the brewery as a fee, had there been one to save him. He was Dehemus, the man with a cancer in his throat. His terrors and hopes had driven him to Europe, where the experts had delved and sliced in his throat, and he had come back to Dr. Gage, whom first he had asked to save him. A terrified, flabby man, he crouched in a big chair in the doctor's private office, waiting. And though he knew it not, the thing he was waiting for was coming toward him. A skeleton, piping on a tibia, swiftly on dancing feet. It was 3 o'clock, and David was making ready to leave his dingy home that faced Blackwell's Island and the river. Note, too, that exactly 11 years had passed since he had been carried out of the Dehemus brewery. With a pulped and broken leg, exactly 11 years since his mother's gods had begun to dream fitfully of murder. And it was exactly 24 hours since he had stood in front of Dr. Gage in his room in the hospital and shown to him a throat death-poisoned with cancer. Now he stood looking at his mother. The youth had gone out of his face. It was a man's face, set and steady as a mask. Old Zakwa stared into his eyes. "David, son of my man," she said, "after all the years, today is the day." And she talked to him of the old vengeance on Dehemus, and of her will, and his will, and the will of her gods, in just such a way she was wont to talk when a new client came to question the gods of the things that are to come to pass. She chattered and chirped instructions to him with queer excitement. One had said the very springs of life within her were dancing and bubbling. A kind of youthfulness, gay and malevolent, looked out of her eyes. Her gods had not failed her. They had ripened her vengeance. They had fastened her curse on the throat of her enemy. There it festered and flowered. Surely the eternal Devas of the East had not failed her. And now, for David could not fail her, her vengeance was secure. So she kissed him and sent him on his way, watching him as he limped down the iron stairs of the tenement. It was a strange, white-faced little figure in his new suit of black clothes, such as are sold in his highway for a few dollars. Too large a hat fell over his brows, and shaded the thin face and the wonderful eyes. Now shuffling along the sidewalk with his queer staccato gait, now carried in a streetcar, he made his way to Fifth Avenue and the house of Dr. Gage. A purple motor car halted at the curb. David did not enter the waiting room. He went down the hall and opened the door of the private office. Dr. Gage looked up at him impatiently. "What the deuce do you mean by coming in here?" he asked. "Listen to what I have to say," David said quickly in that new, vibrant, and compelling voice of his. "Oh, it's you," Dr. Gage said, recognizing the patient who had come to him the day before. "You know, my poor boy, I can do little for you." "No, you can do little for anyone, but what I can do you do not know. I have come here to tell you." All this David repeated in a pompous way that might have been ridiculous had it not been for the strength behind the words. The answer the doctor found was rather curious. "You speak as one having authority," he said, but a moment later he laughed at himself. "You're a strange young man," he added, "but I am a strange old man, so I'll hear what you have to say. If you can say it in 2 minutes. You will pardon me, Mr. Dehemus?" His apology was to the flabby figure in the armchair. "You looked at my throat yesterday," said David. "Look at it now, and then I will speak." Dr. Gage smiled at the air of authority, but for some reason he consented to make the inspection. A moment later he started back and cried, "My God, man!" For the throat he had looked into was that of a hale and healed man. "What is it?" Dehemus whispered angrily, but Dr. Gage did not even glance at him. He was staring at David Rinich, as a bystander may have stared at Lazarus. David sat on the edge of the lacquer chair. He crooked his twisted leg under it and laid his grotesque hat carefully on the floor. "What you could not cure in my throat, another has cured," he said in his stilted way. "And I do not ask you to believe me or to believe your own eyes. My purpose is to convince you. You have men, rich men," David went on, but he did not glance at the crouching bulk of a man in the armchair, "who would give a fortune to be healed, as I have been healed. Therefore I must convince you." Dehemus was whispering anxiously. "His throat? What was the matter with his throat?" But they paid no heed to him. "Convince me?" Dr. Gage repeated. "Convince me?" "I will give you the medicine that cured me, and when you have tested it and tried it, please do not interrupt me. Let me say what I have to say, for I expect you to make every test you please in your laboratory or in the hospital. Yes, certainly in the hospital. There are many poor men as well as rich men dying of that disease. Take one of those poor men, a man doomed to death, a man for whom all your science can do nothing, a man who must die. He will consent to the trial, and when he is cured—" "What's the game?" Dehemus put in querulously. "A game of life and death. I offer life," David said, still looking at the doctor. "And you want to know what I will charge? To heal the poor man of cancer? Nothing. To heal the rich man, $10,000. Since that man has spoken, I tell you my price. I will give you for nothing sufficient medicine to cure one poor man, one hopeless case in your hospital or where you please. I will give you enough to cure 2 such men, if you will, or 3. Then the experiments must cease, and payment must begin." And in those last 3 words, as David spoke them, was the ring of metal and menace. He ended by saying, "I have said what I came to say. Now it is for you to speak." And so the story draws close to the edge of murder. There is no need of pausing here over the discussion that fell between Dr. Gage and Dehemus, or over the long examination whereby Dr. Gage convinced himself of the certain fact that David, his cancerous patient, was wholly healed. Once he was convinced of the reality of the cure, the man of genius that was in the great scientist flashed into enthusiasm. There had still to appear in the transaction Dufayel, the lawyer. His business was to safeguard the man of money and cancer, lest the $10,000 be taken from him. The advice of this shrewd and cynical man of law was this: "You risk nothing. Try this so-called cure on some poor devil already condemned to death. If it saves him, try another. Make sure. I understand your man is willing to supply the medicine for 3 experiments. When you come to try it on Dehemus, I will hold the money. If the young man earns it, I will pay it over. If not, there is no one the poorer, but I hope to heaven I'll have to pay it." "Write me out a paper that the rich man will pay the price when he is healed," David had said, "and I am content." In this way it was settled. Such a contract was signed and given to him. Now, after all this talk of poor men, it was upon a poor woman, dying horribly, the first experiment was made. What happened is a matter of public record. David brought the little phial, filled with reddish liquid, to the hospital and gave it to Dr. Gage. The only excuse Dr. Gage had given for the grim fact that the medicine was not analyzed is that David Rinich would not permit it. The poor woman, who had been told of the experiment, drank it greedily, for she was drinking of her last hope, greedily as though it had been the wine of life. And it was the elixir of life. At dawn she stood erect, and her throat was clean as the mouth of a bride. For Dr. Gage it was as though the floor of the hospital rocked with miracle. For him and Dufayel and the little cohort of medical men and surgeons. There is a full and public record of the second experiment, when a speechless, cancered man was dragged up out of the jaws of death. As before, David brought the medicine old Zakwa had brewed in the ladle to the hospital in a corked phial. As before, he had stood by and seen it administered. A 3rd test was made. As the others succeeded, it succeeded. And the day of Dehemus came. That tortured man was mad with impatience. Hope thrilled and chanted in him. He would have given not 10,000, but 100,000, 500,000. What had he not given? Dufayel, his lawyer, had saner views of the real value of his life. $10,000 was the sum set down in the contract. And that sum was to be paid to David when Dehemus was pronounced by a trinity of experts to be healed. David had carried this paper home, and old Zakwa had hidden it in her breast. How she had chirped and crooned that day! She made the draft for Dehemus, chirping and crooning over a nest of flames in the tin plate on the table. How she fed the flames with fiery fuel, and brewed again the reddish liquid that had given life to a youth, to a woman, to 2 men who lay in the door of death. Always she called to her gods, who were the Devas of the East. David had not heeded much, until of a sudden she gave a cry of triumph, malignant and shrill. And looking quickly up, he saw she was holding a paper in the fire under the ladle. The paper blackened, blazed up, and was consumed. Then David covered his face with his long pale hands and was silent. He knew what paper it was she had burned, and if she had destroyed that promise of $10,000, then what price was Dehemus to pay? And suddenly he saw her vengeance as something formless and black, a cloud filled with venom, and he knew the murder of which she had whispered for so many years was ready to strike. How had he dreamed, or dared to dream, that he was to carry life to Dehemus as to the other 3? He was Death's errand boy. The reddish brew in the phial was old Zakwa's vengeance, perfected in the years. Who drank it, drank death. Yet when she gave it into his hands, he took it quietly and made ready to do his errand. She held him for a moment. "David, son of my man," she cried, and threw herself down and kissed and stroked his twisted leg and chirped and chuckled to herself, or to her gods in spasms of frightful merriment. An old hag drunk with the drink of vengeance, and his mother. He looked back at her as he went out, and there was a strange smile on his white face. She should have what she had sought so long. Her will and the will of her gods should be done. It was the day of Dehemus, and David went limping swiftly through the streets to the house in Fifth Avenue, where the hope-shaken man crouched in the great armchair. By the chair Dr. Gage stood. There were 3 other surgeons in the room, a doctor of medicine, and a white-garbed woman, a nurse. By the window, Dufayel the lawyer lounged in a lazy attitude, but his eyes were cynical and alert. "Quite ready?" Dr. Gage said softly. He took the bottle and held it between his eyes and the light. Indeed, every eye was on that red-tinted phial, even the blue, protuberant eyes of Dehemus, as the great surgeon held it up to the light. Every eye save those of Dufayel, the man of law. He was scrutinizing David's pale, mask-like face. What he saw there he could never explain, not even to himself. It may be that he saw nothing, and it may be he caught a fugitive glimpse of a young soul staring into the blackness of death. For David at that moment stood face to face with his tragedy. His thought was with his old mother. He could see her twisting in frightful merriment as she dreamed of her vengeance on Dehemus, the fruit of so many years. Even so, she should have her vengeance. That was her due. He would not thrust himself between her and her reward. What she had sown, she should reap. And what was he but the sickle in her hand? What must be, must be. Only there was one thing David knew. When vengeance is taken, someone must pay. If old Zakwa won, she must lose, for that is the law of things. She must pay for what she wanted most with what she held dearest. And thinking thus, David lifted his head, and there was a smile on his white face. Dr. Gage was speaking to him. "It is a larger bottle, isn't it?" he asked. "Yes, there's more than is needed," David answered slowly. "For him." Dr. Gage poured the reddish liquid into a measuring glass, filling it to the exact line that marked the proper dose. A little more than a third of the drug was left in the phial. Still smiling in his strange way, David picked up the little bottle and held it to the light. "A wonderful medicine, Dr. Gage," he said. "A very wonderful medicine. It has a harsh and evil taste, but you can drink it like milk. It heals, and it cannot harm, like Milk, he repeated and set up the phial to his lips and drank. Then he straightened up as best he could on his crippled leg and folded his thin arms across his heart. And always he smiled like a brave man among enemies. Dehemus broke the silence. "You all keep me waiting," he croaked angrily, "for weeks and weeks." Dr. Gage administered the medicine. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and the Dehemus heaved himself out of the chair and stood, gasping but radiant as though he had indeed quaffed a cup of life. They laid him on the chair again, the doctors in a cluster round him. David spoke in his hard metallic voice, again as one having authority. "Let the experts decide. When the 3 experts have decided, I shall come for the price, and now I shall go." No one answered him. The doctors were listening to Dehemus, who was still clamoring that he was healed and would not be still. Even Dufayel was leaning over the nurse's shoulder, staring at the rich man who had been called back to life and abundant health. David hobbled out. Once in the avenue, he hurried on at a great pace and turned into a side street. There he went more slowly, for his crooked leg kept crumpling up under him. At last he fell and rolled over on his side. His head jerked horribly, then his mouth twisted open, and, little by little, a glaze crept over his eyes, and David Reinich was dead. Almost at the same time, the poor frightened soul of the Dehemus was wrenched out of his body, in the presence of 4 great surgeons, a qualified medical man, a trained nurse, and a leading lawyer of the New York bar. No mole murder. Dehemus was done to death in a blaze of light. What was it the little school teacher said of the gentle lad she loved? "David will be a great man some day," she said. He was a great man, but not in the way she thought. End of Section 1. The Day of Dehemus by Vance Thompson. Section 2 of The Grim 13. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Rain by Dana Burnett. The rain had fallen for a week, steadily, monotonously, relentlessly. There had been no storm, no bluster of wind. The sky was a gray mask covering the face of God. In all the world there was no sound but the drip, drip, drip of rain. Allie Baird stood at her bedroom window, clad in nightdress and faded calico wrapper, her long yellow hair falling over her shoulders. In the distance lay the little Maine fishing village, huddled against the sky, and beyond it the drab reach of the sea. Out of the cluster of wet roofs, a lone steeple stood grimly aloft like a tombstone dominating a graveyard. Allie regarded that steeple with an especial hatred. It belonged to the church she had been married in. As she stood there shivering with the cold, a desolate picture composed itself in her mind. She saw again the naked wooden altar, heard once more the voice of the lugubrious minister pronouncing sentence upon her soul, felt the cold hand of Jim Baird fumbling for her hand, and the colder embrace of the ring upon her finger. It had rained that day, as it was raining now. 18 years. And in all that time only 3 things of importance had happened to her. First, the birth of her child. Second, the death of her child. And third, a trip to Portland for a minor operation. Except for these events, her life had been a barren desert of days. In the bed behind her a man stirred and grunted. She turned quickly, gazing down at her husband with a new and critical interest. His huge body bulked large beneath the tumbled coverings. His florid face, with its inevitable stubble of beard, seemed unusually hideous against the untidy pillow. His small eyes leered up at her with that maddening lifelessness, that phlegmatic stare which had begun to sicken her. "Still raining, Allie?" "Still raining." He had asked that question every morning for a week, and she had answered it in the same way. But this morning her voice trembled. He heard and scolded her peevishly for her incaution of dress. "You'll catch your death going about in that wrapper. Why don't you get your clothes on like a sensible woman?" She did not reply, and he settled into his wallow with a ponderous groan. "Ain't no use my getting up a while. This rain's a first-rate jailer. Call me when breakfast's ready." "I'll call you, Jim." She dressed listlessly, and in silence. The man in the bed began to snore. She went swiftly out of the room with a little indrawn breath, her hair still hanging loosely down her back. Entering the kitchen, she laid the fire, lighted it, and set about the business of getting breakfast, only pausing to sip a cup of coffee. This she drank standing at the window, her eyes fixed upon the distant gray blur of ocean that formed the horizon of her world. Suddenly her gaze grew more intent. A dull light flickered in her eyes. She had seen a sail upon the far water, a draggled moth struggling through the rain. "There now, Allie, you've burnt the bacon. Thought I smelled it scorching." Jim Baird, in shirt, trousers, and gray cotton slacks, stood sniffing in the doorway. Having justified his suspicions, he shuffled forward, grumbling. "Just like you," he muttered. "Always looking out the window and not minding your housework." She did not seem to hear the familiar arraignment. His eyes were still bright with looking out of the window. "I thought I saw a sail, Jim." "Pshaw, what if you did? Ain't nothing to get excited about, is it?" Still, she did not heed the indictment in his tone. "Look, Jim, isn't that a schooner out there, off the point?" Jim looked, obviously to arm himself with a denial. "I don't see no sail," he stated positively. Allie smiled, a slow, terrible smile. "You never see the things I see, do you, Jim?" "I don't see no schooner off the point, not in this weather. You don't either, though you're always saying you do. Soon as you get a little mite fidgety, you begin seeing ships off the point. Ain't you never forgot?" He stopped, sobered by the expression on her face, and returned querulously to the first charge against her. "You always was careless and wasteful, Allie," he complained, prodding the defunct bacon with a mournful forefinger. "Careless and wasteful, with bacon costing what it does." "It doesn't cost as much as whiskey." "Now, Allie." "Whiskey's the thing that has ruined you, Jim Baird, not my carelessness." "Well, now, I ain't allowing that I'm ruined, Allie. The farm still pays expenses and a little mite over, and as for what you said, you know I ain't no heavy drinker." "I wish to God you were. I wish you'd go out and get drunk like a man and come home and beat me, if you wanted to. It's this everlasting taking it behind my back, and then lying to yourself to ease your conscience." "Now, Allie, you know that ain't true. You know I'm subject to colds. Doctor said a drop or two wouldn't hurt me."
"He didn't say to drink a bottle a week."
"I ain't drunk a bottle. There's some. Now, Allie, you know I need a tonic. This house is chilled through. The weather's murderous, plain murderous."
"Don't say that word."
She stood over him, her bosom heaving, a pitiful, frightened helplessness in her eyes. It was as though she recognized her growing inability to struggle against fate. Jim Baird looked at her with the faint bravado that is the invariable cloak of cowardice. Then he sat down at the table and began to eat, after the manner of his kind. Allie watched him with a strange horror, a cumulative loathing that was as new in its expression as it was old in its origin. He ate like a beast. It seemed that this week of bad weather was bringing to the surface many of her hidden emotions, her secret opinions, her long-concealed hatreds. The endless drip of the rain had begun to wear upon her callous spirit, to rasp her nerves. She could not remember when she had been shut up with him under one roof for such a long time before. She wished that he had not said it was murderous weather. After breakfast he went into the front room, a pathetically drooping chamber filled with ornaments that belied their mission of cheer, the chamber in which was gathered the concentrated dreariness of that house. From a small cabinet he took a bottle and drank, not recklessly, but rather stingily, as though fearful of imbibing more than was strictly necessary to his intoxication, after which he filled his pipe and sat down by the window. Allie moved slowly about the kitchen, prolonging as far as possible the washing of the dishes. At last she picked up the carving knife, a long, sharp-bladed affair, and began to scour it with trembling hands. There was an appalling tumult in her heart. The frightened look had returned to her eyes. Suddenly she lifted her head. The knife fell clattering to the floor. With an air of grim determination, she walked into the front room and sat down at her husband's side.
"Jim, I want to talk to you."
The peaceful vacuity of Jim Baird's countenance gave place to an uncontrollable peevishness, but he managed an artificial smile. "All right, Allie, talk ahead. I guess you're lonesome. Is that it?"
"That's it, Jim. I'm lonesome, and it doesn't seem right somehow. It doesn't seem natural. We're husband and wife, Jim, and we ought to talk more. We ought to talk about—"
"The weather?"
"God, no." Then what, Allie? She shook her head hopelessly. What do other husbands and wives talk about when they're shut in together? Are they all like this? If they are, then they're nothing but prisoners. Now, Allie, you've got to talk to me, Jim. You've got to find something we can share, something we can take an interest in. All our lives we've gone along like this. We're strangers after 18 years, and it's killing me. Oh, Jim, if you'd only try to be a man. If you'd only quit drinking and go to work again. I mean, real work. Work that means something. I'll help you, Jim. I'll work with you. Why, Allie, what's come over you? Ain't you got 3 meals a day and a good bed to sleep in? Yes, but that's not living. That's just keeping your body warm. I want something else, something I can look forward to. A trip to Portland, maybe, or a new dress, or one of those little autos that don't cost so much that I could run myself. An automobile? An automobile? Allie Baird wants an automobile. That's what it's all about, eh? I knew there was something on your mind besides the weather. An automobile. God Almighty, ain't I got troubles enough without having a spendthrift wife? He had risen from his chair and was facing her in a sullen fury. She drew back slowly, her arm half lifted as though to ward off a blow, but still she clung to the hopeless dream of making him see, of making him understand. It isn't that, Jim. I swear it isn't that. I don't care about having an auto. I only want something that we could take pleasure in, and... You lie, Allie Baird. Get back into that kitchen and be thankful you ain't walking the streets in the rain. Her arms fell to her sides. A dry sob escaped her lips. She turned and went warily from the room. In the kitchen, she sank down by the window and put her head on her arms. It seemed as though the rain had stopped at last. In the orchard behind the rambling old farmhouse, a young girl walked with her lover. The air was sweet with the fragrance of apple blossoms. The twilight established about them a kingdom of shadows and infinite solitudes where they might wander in peace and safety. The man was fair-haired, blue-eyed, with the proud carriage of a young Viking. He was sailing at daybreak for George Banks. It was to be his last trip before they were married. "You'll be standing at the window," he said, tightening his arm about her waist, "and you'll see the Swallow rounding the point. You can tell her by the canvas she carries, and you'll put on the ring I gave you, for you'll know it's Hartley Taylor coming home for his sweetheart." "If you shouldn't come," she whispered, and swayed against him. He took her in his arms and kissed her. "I'll come one way or another," he said. "One way or another. Wait for me always." He went at dawn in the Swallow schooner. She stood at the window, his ring against her lips, watching his sails until they showed no more. A week later, the remnants of the fishing fleet came driving home in the teeth of the gale. But Hartley Taylor did not come, though she watched the point night and day, all long winter through. And when the spring came again, her heart was dead in her breast. She went down to the edge of the great water and gave his ring to the sea. The following June, at the urgent request of both her father and mother, she married Jim Baird, who wanted a wife and was willing to trade for one upon a purely business basis. Allie awoke with a sigh. Her glance involuntarily sought the distant headland, thrust like a welcoming hand into the sea. Was it a sail that she saw, or was it another illusion of her mind? The ceaseless patter of rain at the window stirred her to full consciousness. Her relaxed nerves tightened. Her brain throbbed with the endless reiteration of the thought that she had been fighting against ever since the dawn. She cooked dinner and sat in her chair by the window while Jim Baird ate. She herself did not taste food. The carving knife still lay on the floor between them. The man picked it up, muttering something about her carelessness, and placed it on the table beside her. She did not speak nor turn her head. He returned to the front room, renewed his miserly dissipations. But now he drank more boldly with a false courage born of hate. Allie's plea had shaken him from that numbing lethargy, that sensual refuge into which he had crept for shelter against the very thing she demanded so passionately, life. And he raged inwardly at her who had pricked him. By night he was thoroughly drunk. When she called him to his supper, he came reeling, and fell into his chair with a loud laugh that echoed mockingly through the silent house. For some moments he essayed a ghastly humor, making jests about the rain, which he likened to the flood, vowing that it presaged the end of the world. Allie sat with her back toward him, her body rigid, her hands gripping the chair. Finally he rose and approached her. "You told me to get drunk and beat you," he snarled, and struck her on the cheek with his open hand. Come to the table," he added, breathing hard. "'Tain't right to turn your back on your husband. 'Tain't natural." To his own maudlin amazement, she did exactly as he commanded. She sat down opposite him, leaned her elbows on the table, and looked at him with a smile. It was a smile that lighted her whole countenance, a strange radiance caused by some burning within her breast. It was as though in striking her he had kindled a slumbering spark to flame. Her eyes gleamed, her cheeks were flushed as with a fever. That night, for the first time in 18 years, Allie Baird did not wash the supper dishes. As soon as he had gone, she went upstairs and put on her white dress, the only one she owned besides her monotonous gingham. Then she returned to the kitchen, blew out the lamp, and waited for Jim Baird to go to bed. The lighthouse on the point had begun to glow. She kept her gaze upon that distant flame. It steadied her. The rain fell steadily, monotonously, as it had fallen for days, as it had fallen for ages. She heard Jim's stumbling progress up the stairs, his heavy breathing, his low-voiced growl as he cursed the dark. Still she waited, in her white dress, her hair down her back. Time, that had seemed so interminable to her that morning, was now but an inconsequential trifle. A clock in the front room struck 3 with muffled tones. She rose from her chair, picked up the long-bladed knife, and slowly mounted the stairs. As she entered the bedroom, a reek of whiskey assailed her nostrils. She felt, rather than saw, her husband's huge bulk upon the bed. He was sleeping the deep sleep of drunkenness, and he whimpered a little as he breathed. She crept close, leaned down, and kissed him. "Poor Jim," she whispered. Then lifting the knife high in the air, she drove it home. She had reached the open window, somehow, and was kneeling before it, her arms across the sill. A ship was coming for her through the rain, a schooner with all canvas set, plunging through the gray sea of the mist, a white shape afloat upon the air. The woman at the window smiled and reached into her bosom for the ring her lover had given her, but the ring was not there. Then she glanced once more at the oncoming ship, and saw Hartley Taylor standing at the lee rail, with the ring in his hand and the light of its single stone filling the world with glory. "I'll come, one way or another." She felt the light upon her face, upon her hair, and held out her hands to him in greeting, crying his name across the shriveled waters. Jim Baird awoke with a start, groaned ponderously, and fell back upon his pillow. "Still raining, Allie?" There was no reply. He glanced toward the window and saw her kneeling at the sill in a brilliant flood of sunshine, her head upon her arms and her yellow hair falling about her shoulders like so much spun gold. He began to scold her querulously. "Now, Allie, you'll catch your death." Something in her stillness checked the words on his lips. He got awkwardly out of bed, his face a mottled gray, and walked slowly toward the kneeling figure. Suddenly he halted and stared panic-stricken at a dark stain on the floor. His legs gave way beneath him. He sank into a chair, a growing horror in his eyes. "Just like you, Allie," he moaned. "Couldn't stand a little bad weather. If you just waited another day. Sun's out now." He looked once more at that still figure by the window, saw the light on her hair, felt the immeasurable distance between them. Then he began to sob weakly. End of Section 2. Rain by Dana Burnett.
Section 3 of The Grim 13. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Old Fags by Stacy Aumonier. This remarkable literary achievement has probably caused more heartache to magazine editors than any other manuscript rejected in years. It was approved by every member of the reading staff of a magazine noted for the literary distinction of its fiction, but after a conference call specially to discuss the story, it was finally rejected. The editor of another magazine thinks Old Fags the best story he has read in 10 years. We consider it fortunate privilege to be allowed to print it, being confident the discerning reader for whom this collection is published will appreciate the unusual quality of the work. Old Fags. The boys called him Old Fags, and the reason was not hard to seek. He occupied a room in a block of tenements off Lisson Grove, bearing the somewhat grandiloquent title of Bolingbroke Buildings, and conspicuous among the many doubtful callings that occupied his time was one in which he issued forth with a deplorable old canvas sack, which after a day's peregrination along the gutters he would manage to partly fill with cigar and cigarette ends. The exact means by which he managed to convert this patiently gathered garbage into the wherewithal to support his disreputable body, nobody took the trouble to inquire, nor was there any further interest aroused by the disposal of the contents of the same sack when he returned with the gleanings of dustbins, distributed thoughtfully at intervals along certain thoroughfares by a maternal borough council. No one had ever penetrated to the inside of his room, but the general opinion in Bolingbroke Buildings was that he managed to live in a state of comfortable filth. And Mrs. Reed, who lived in the room opposite number 477 with her 4 children, was of the opinion that old fags had ordered up a bit. He certainly was never behind with the payment of the weekly 3 and 6 that entitled him to the sole enjoyment of number 475, and when the door was opened, among the curious blend of odors that issued forth, that of onions and other luxuries of this sort was undeniable. Nevertheless, he was not a popular figure in the buildings. Many, in fact, looked upon him as a social blot on the Bolingbroke escutcheon. The inhabitants were mostly laborers, and their wives, charwomen and lady helps, dressmakers, assistants, and mechanics. There was a vague tentative effort among a great body of them to be a little respectable, and among some even to be clean. No such uncomfortable considerations hampered the movements of old fags. He was frankly and ostentatiously a social derelict. He had no pride and no shame. He shuffled out in the morning, his blotchy face covered with dirt and black hair, his threadbare green clothes tattered and in rags, the toes all too visible through his forlorn-looking boots. He was rather a large man, with a fat, flabby person, and a shiny face that was over-affable and bleary through a too constant attention to the gin bottle. He had a habit of ceaseless talk. He talked and chuckled to himself all the time. He talked to everyone he met in an undercurrent of jeering affability. Sometimes he would retire to his room with a gin bottle for days together, and then, the walls at Bolingbroke Buildings are not very thick, he would be heard to talk and chuckle and snore alternately, until the percolating atmosphere of stewed onions heralded the fact that old Fags was shortly on the warpath again. He would meet Mrs. Reed with her children on the stairs and would mutter, "Oh, here we are again, all these dear little children. Been out for a walk, eh? Oh, these dear little children." And he would pat one of them gaily on the head, and Mrs. Reed would say, "Here, you, keep your filthy hands off my kids, you dirty old swine, or I'll catch you a swipe over the mouth." And old Fags would shuffle off muttering, oh dear, these dear little children. Oh dear. And the boys would call after him and even throw orange peel and other things at him, but nothing seemed to disturb the serenity of old Fags. Even when young Charlie Good threw a dead mouse that hit him on the chin, he only said, "Oh, these boys, these boys." Quarrels, noise, and bad odors were the prevailing characteristics of Bolingbroke Buildings, and old Fags, though contributing in some degree to the latter quality, rode serenely through the other two in spite of multiform aggression. The penetrating intensity of his onion stew had driven 2 lodgers already from number 476, and was again a source of aggravation to the present holders. Old Mrs. Birtle and her daughter Minnie. Minnie Birtle was what was known as a tweenie at a house in Hyde Park Square, but she lived at home. Her mistress, to whom she had never spoken, being engaged by the housekeeper, was Mrs. Bastian Melland, a lady who owned a valuable collection of little dogs. These little dogs somehow gave Minnie an unfathomable sense of respectability. She loved to talk about them. She told Mrs. Reed that her mistress paid hundreds and hundreds of pounds for each of them. They were taken out every day by a groom on 2 leads of 5, 10 highly groomed, bustling, yapping, snapping, vicious little luxuries. Some had won prizes at dog shows, and 2 men were engaged for the sole purpose of ministering to their creature comforts. The consciousness of working in a house which furnished such an exhibition of festive cultivation brought into sharp relief the degrading social condition of her next-room neighbor. Minnie hated old Fags with a bitter hatred. She even wrote to a firm of lawyers who represented some remote landlord and complained of the dirty habits of the old drunken wretch next door. But she never received any answer to her complaint. It was known that old Fags had lived there for 7 years and paid his rent regularly. Moreover, on one critical occasion, Mrs. Reed, who had periods of rheumatic gout and could not work, had got into hopeless financial straits, having reached the very limit of her borrowing capacity, and being 3 weeks in arrears with her rent, old Fags had come over and had insisted on lending her 15 shillings. Mrs. Reed eventually paid it back, and the knowledge of the transaction further accentuated her animosity toward him. One day, old Fags was returning from his dubious round, and was passing through Hyde Park Square with his canvas bag slung over his back, when he ran into the cortege of little dogs under the control of Meads, the groom. Oh dear, muttered old Fags to himself. What dear little dogs. What dear little dogs. A minute later, Minnie Birtle ran up the area steps and gave Meads a bright smile. "Good night, Mr. Meads," she said. Mr. Meads looked at her and said, "Hello, you off?" "Yes," she answered. "Oh, well," he said. "Good night, be good." They both sniggered, and Minnie hurried down the street. Before she reached Lisson Grove, old Fags had caught her up. "I say," he said, getting into her stride, "what dear little dogs those are. Oh, dear, what dear little dogs." Minnie turned, and when she saw him, her face flushed, and she said, "Oh, you go to hell," with which unladylike expression she darted across the road and was lost to sight. "Oh, these women," said old Fags to himself. "These women." It often happened thereafter that old Fags's business carried him in the neighborhood of Hyde Park Square, and he ran into the little dogs. One day he even ventured to address Meads and to congratulate him on the beauty of his canine protégés, an attention that elicited a very unsympathetic response. A response, in fact, that amounted to being told to clear off. The incident of old Fags running into this society was entirely accidental. It was due in part to the fact that the way lay through there to a tract of land in Paddington that old Fags seemed to find peculiarly attractive. It was a neglected strip of ground by the railway that butted at one end onto a canal. It would have made quite a good siding, but that it seemed somehow to have been overlooked by the railway company, and to have become a dumping ground for tins and old refuse from the houses in the neighborhood of Harrow Road. Old Fags would spend hours there alone with his canvas bag. When the winter came on, there was a great wave of what the papers would call economic unrest. There were strikes in 3 great industries, a political upheaval, and a severe tightening of the money market. All of these misfortunes reacted on Bolingbroke buildings. The dwellers became even more impecunious, and consequently more quarrelsome, more noisy, and more malodorous. Rents were all in arrears, ejections were the order of the day, and borrowing became a tradition rather than an actuality. Want and hunger brooded over the dejected buildings. But still old Fags came and went, carrying his shameless gin and permeating the passages with his onion stews. Old Mrs. Birtle became bedridden, and the support of room number 476 fell on the shoulders of Minnie. The wages of a tweenie are not excessive, and the way in which she managed to support herself and her invalid mother must have excited the wonder of the other dwellers in the building, if they had not had more pressing affairs of their own to wonder about. Minnie was a short, sallow little thing with a rather full figure and heavy gray eyes that somehow conveyed a sense of sleeping passion. She had a certain instinct for dress, a knack of putting some trinket in the right place, and of always being neat. Mrs. Bastian Melland had one day asked who she was. On being informed, her curiosity did not prompt her to push the matter further, and she did not speak to her, but the incident gave Minnie a better standing in the domestic household at Hyde Park Square. It was probably this attention that caused Meads, the head dog-groom, to cast an eye in her direction. It is certain that he did so, and moreover, on a certain Thursday evening had taken her to a cinema performance in the Edgware Road. Such attention naturally gave rise to discussion, and alas, to jealousy, for there was an under-housemaid and even a lady's maid who were not impervious to the attentions of the good-looking groom. When Mrs. Bastian Melland went to Egypt in January, she took only 3 of the small dogs with her, for she could not be bothered with the society of a groom, and 3 dogs were as many as her 2 maids could spare time for, after devoting their energies to Mrs. Bastian Melland's toilet. Consequently, Meads was left behind and was held directly responsible for 7, 5 chows and 2 Pekingese, or as he expressed it, over 1,000 pounds worth of dogs. It was a position of enormous responsibility. They had to be fed on the very best food, all carefully prepared and cooked, and in small quantities. They had to be taken for regular exercise, and washed in specially prepared condiments. Moreover, at the slightest symptom of indisposition, he was to telephone to Sir Andrew Fossiter, the great veterinary specialist in Hanover Square. It is not to be wondered at that Meads became a person of considerable standing and envy, and that little Minnie Birtle was intensely flattered when he occasionally condescended to look in her direction. She had been in Mrs. Bastian Mellon's service now for 7 months, and the attentions of the dog-groom had not only been a matter of general observation for some time past, but had become a subject of reckless mirth and innuendo among the other servants. One night she was hurrying home. Her mother had been rather worse than usual of late, and she was carrying a few scraps that the cook had given her. It was a wretched night, and she was not feeling well herself. A mood of tired dejection possessed her. She crossed a drab street off Lisson Grove, and as she reached the curb, her eye lighted on old Faggs. He did not see her. He was walking along the gutter, patting the road occasionally with his stick. She had not spoken to him since the occasion we have mentioned. For once he was not talking, his eyes were fixed in a listless apathy on the road. As he passed, she caught the angle of his chin silhouetted against the window of a shop. For the rest of her walk, the haunting vision of that chin beneath the drawn cheeks and the brooding hopelessness of those sunken eyes kept recurring to her. Perhaps in some remote past he had been as good to look upon as Meads, the groom. Perhaps someone had cared for him. She had tried to push this thought from her, but some chord in her nature seemed to have been awakened and to vibrate with an unaccountable sympathy toward this undesirable fellow-lodger. She hurried home, and in the night was ill. She could not go to Mrs. Mellon's for 3 days, and she wanted the money badly. When she got about again, she was subject to fainting fits and sickness. On one such occasion, as she was going upstairs at the buildings, she felt faint and leant against the wall just as old Faggs was going up. He stopped and said, "Hello, now what are we doing? Oh dear. And she said, "It's all right, old 'un." These were the kindest words she had ever spoken to old Faggs. During the next month there were strange symptoms about Minnie Birtle that caused considerable comment, and there were occasions when old Mrs. Birtle pulled herself together and became the active partner and waited on Minnie. On one such occasion, old Faggs came home late and, after drawing a cork, varied his usual program of talking and snoring by singing in a maudlin key, and old Mrs. Birtle came banging at his door and shrieking out, "Stop your row, you old... My daughter's ill. Can't you hear?" And old Faggs came to his door and blinked at her and said, "Ill, is she? Oh dear. Would she like some stew, eh?" And old Mrs. Birtle said, "No, she don't want any of your muck," and bundled back. But they did not hear any more of old Faggs that night, or any other night when Minnie came home queer. Early in March, Minnie got the sack from Hyde Park Square. Mrs. Melland was still away, having decided to winter in Rome, but the housekeeper assumed the responsibility of this action, and in writing to Mrs. Melland, justified the course she had taken by saying that she could not expect the other maids to work in the same house with an unmarried girl in that condition. Mrs. Melland, whose letter in reply was full of the serious illness of poor little Anisette, one of the chows that had suffered in Egypt on account of a maid giving it too much rice with its boned chicken, and how much better it had been in Rome under the treatment of Dr. Lascati, made no special reference to the question of Minnie Birtle, only saying that she was so sorry if Mrs. Bellingham was having trouble with these tiresome servants. The spring came in the summer, and the 2 inhabitants of room 476 eked out their miserable existence. One day Minnie would pull herself together and get a day's charring, and occasionally Mrs. Birtle would struggle along to a laundry in Maida Vale, where a benevolent proprietress would pay her 1 shilling and 3 to do a day's ironing, for the old lady was rather neat with her hands. And once, when things were very desperate, the brother of a nephew from Walthamstow turned up. He was a small cabinet-maker by trade, and he agreed to allow them 3 shillings a week, till things righted themselves a bit. But nothing was seen of Meads, the groom. One night Minnie was rather worse, and the idea occurred to her that she would like to send a message to him. It was right that he should know. He had made no attempt to see her since she had left Mrs. Melland's service. She lay awake thinking of him and wondering how she could send a message when she suddenly thought of old Faggs. He had been quiet of late. Whether the demand for cigarette ends was abating and he could not afford the luxuries that their disposal seemed to supply, or whether he was keeping quiet for any ulterior reason, she was not able to determine. In the morning, she sent her mother across to ask him if he would oblige by calling at Hyde Park Square, and asking Mr. Meads if he would oblige by calling at 476 Bolingbroke Buildings to see Miss Birtle. There is no record of how Old Fags delivered this message, but it is known that the same afternoon Mr. Meads did call. He left about 3:30 in a great state of perturbation, and in a very bad temper. He passed Old Fags on the stairs, and the only comment he made was, "I never have any luck, God help me," and he did not return, although he had apparently promised to do so. In a few weeks' time, the position of the occupants of room 476 became desperate. It was, in fact, a desperate time all round. Work was scarce and money scarcer. Waves of ill temper and depression swept Bolingbroke Buildings. Mrs. Reed had gone, heaven knows where. Even Old Fags seemed at the end of his tether. True, he still managed to secure his inevitable bottle, but the stews became scarcer and less potent. All Mrs. Birtle's time and energy were taken up in nursing Minnie, and the two somehow existed on the money, now increased to 4 shillings a week, which the sympathetic cabinet-maker from Walthamstow allowed them. The question of rent was shelved. 4 shillings a week for 2 people means ceaseless, gnawing hunger. The widow and her daughter lost pride and hope, and further messages to Mr. Meads failed to elicit any response. The widow became so desperate that she even asked Old Fags one night if he could spare a little stew for her daughter, who was starving. The pungent odor of the hot food was too much for her. Old Fags came to the door. "Oh dear," he said. "What trouble there is. Let's see what we can do." He messed about for some time and then took it across to them. It was a strange concoction, meat that it would have been difficult to know what to ask for at a butcher's, and many bones, but the onions seemed to pull it together. To anyone starving, it was good. After that, it became a sort of established thing. Whenever Old Fags had a stew, he sent some over to the widow and the daughter. But apparently things were not going too well in the cigarette-in trade, for the stews became more and more intermittent, and sometimes were desperately bony. And then one night a climax was reached. Old Fags was awakened in the night by fearful screams. There was a district nurse in the next room, and also a student from the great hospital. No one knows how it all affected Old Fags. He went out at a very unusual hour in the early morning, and seemed more garrulous and meandering in his speech. He stopped the widow in the passage and mumbled incomprehensible solicitude. Minnie was very ill for 3 days, but she recovered, faced by the insoluble proposition of feeding 3 mouths instead of 2, and 2 of them requiring enormous quantities of milk. This terrible crisis brought out many good qualities in various people. The cabinet-maker sent 10 shillings extra, and others came forward as though driven by some race instinct. Old Fags disappeared for 10 days after that. It was owing to an unfortunate incident in Hyde Park, when he insisted on sleeping on a flower bed with a gin bottle under his left arm, and on account of the unreasonable attitude that he took up toward a policeman in the matter. When he returned, things were assuming their normal course. Mrs. Birtle's greeting was, "Hello, old 'un, we've missed your stews." Old Fags had undoubtedly secured a more stable position in the eyes of the Birtles, and one day he was even allowed to see the baby. He talked to it from the door. Oh dear," he said. "What a beautiful little baby. What a dear little baby. Oh dear, oh dear." The baby shrieked with unrestrained terror at sight of him, but that night some more stew was sent in. Then the autumn came on. People whose romantic instincts had been touched at the arrival of the child gradually lost interest and fell away. Cabinet-maker from Walthamstow wrote a long letter, saying that after next week the payment of the 4 shillings would have to stop. He hoped he had been of some help in their trouble, but that things were going on all right now. Of course, he had to think of his own family first, and so on. The lawyers of the remote landlord, who was assiduously killing stags in Scotland, regretted that their client could not see his way to allow any further delay in the matter of the payment of rent due. The position of the Birtle family became once more desperate. Old Mrs. Birtle had become frailer, and though Minnie could now get about, she found work difficult to obtain, owing to people's demand for a character from the last place. Their thoughts once more reverted to Meads, and Minnie lay in wait for him one morning as he was taking the dogs out. There was a very trying scene ending in a very vulgar quarrel, and Minnie came home and cried all the rest of the day and through half the night. Old Fags' stews became scarcer and less palatable. He, too, seemed in dire straits. We now come to an incident that, we are ashamed to say, owes its inception to the effect of alcohol. It was a wretched morning in late October, bleak and foggy. The The blue-gray corridors of Bolingbroke buildings seemed to exude damp. The strident voices of the unkempt children quarreling in the courtyard below permeated the whole buildings. The strange odor, that was its characteristic, lay upon it like the foul breath of some evil god. All its inhabitants seemed hungry, wretched, and vile. Their lives of constant protest seemed for the moment lulled to a sullen indifference, whilst they huddled behind their gloomy doors and listened to the raucous railings of their offspring. The widow Birtle and her daughter sat silently in their room. The child was asleep. It had had its milk, and it would have to have its milk, whatever happened. The crumbs from the bread the women had had at breakfast lay ungathered on the bare table. They were both hungry and very desperate. There was a knock at the door. Minnie went to it, and there stood old Fags. He leered at them meekly, and under his arm carried a gin bottle 3 parts full. Oh dear, he said. What a dreadful day, what a dreadful day. Will you have a little drop of gin to comfort you? Now, what do you say? Minnie looked at her mother. In other days, the door would have been slammed in his face, but old Fags had certainly been kind in the matter of stews. They asked him to sit down. Then old Mrs. Birtle did accept just a tiny drop of gin, and they both persuaded Minnie to have a little. Now neither of the women had had food of any worth for days, and the gin went straight to their heads. It was already in old Fag's head, firmly established. The 3 immediately became garrulous. They all talked volubly and intimately. The women railed old Fags about his dirt, but allowed that he had a good art. They talked longingly and lovingly about his stews, and old Fag said, Well, my dears, you shall have the finest stew you've ever had in your lives tonight. He repeated this 9 times, only each time the whole sentence sounded like one word. Then the conversation drifted to the child and the hard lot of parents, and by a natural sequence to Meads, its father. Meads was discussed with considerable bitterness, and the constant reiteration of the threat by the women that they meant to have the lure on him all right, mingled with the jeering sophistries of old Fags on the gentleman's behavior, and the impossibility of expecting a dog-groom to be a sportsman, lasted a considerable time. Old Fags talked expansively about leaving it to him, and somehow, as he stood there with his large puffy figure looming up in the dimly lighted room and waving his long arms, he appeared to the women a figure of portentous significance. In the eyes of the women he typified powers they had not dreamt of. Under the veneer of his hidebound depravity, Minnie seemed to detect some slow-moving force trying to assert itself. He meandered on in a vague monologue, using terms and expressions they did not know the meaning of. He gave the impression of some fettered animal launching a fierce indictment against the fact of its life. At last he took up the gin bottle and moved to the door, and then leered round the room. You shall have the finest stew you've ever had in your life tonight, my dears. He repeated this 7 times again, and then went heavily out. That afternoon a very amazing fact was observed by several inhabitants of Bolingbroke buildings. Old Fags washed his face. He went out about 3 o'clock without his sack. His face had certainly been cleaned up, and his clothes seemed in some mysterious fashion to hold together. He went across Lisbon Grove and made for Hyde Park Square. He hung about for nearly an hour at the corner, and then he saw a man come up the area steps of a house on the south side and walk rapidly away. Old Fags followed him. He took a turning sharp to the left through a mews and entered a narrow street at the end. There he entered a deserted-looking pub, kept by an ex-butler and his wife. He passed right through to a room at the back and called for some beer. Before it was brought, old Fags was seated at the next table ordering gin. Dear, oh dear, what a wretched day, said old Fags. The groom grunted assent, but old Fags was not to be put off by mere indifference. He broke ground on 1 or 2 subjects that interested the groom, one subject in particular being dog. He seemed to have a profound knowledge of dog, and before Mr. Meads quite realized what was happening, he was trying gin in his beer at old Fags' expense. The groom was feeling particularly morose that afternoon. His luck seemed out. Bookmakers had appropriated several half-crowns that he sorely begrudged, and he had other expenses. The beer-gin mixture comforted him in the rambling eloquence of the old fool, who seemed disposed to be content paying for drinks and talking, fitted in with his mood. They drank and talked for a full hour, and at length got to a subject that all men get to sooner or later if they drink and talk long enough, the subject of woman. Mr. Meads became confiding and philosophic. He talked of women in general and what triumphs and adventures he had had among them in particular, but what a trial and tribulation they had been to him in spite of all. Old Fags winked knowingly and was splendidly comprehensive and tolerant of Meade's peccadilloes. "It's all a game," said Meads. "You got to manage 'em. There ain't much I don't know, old bird." Then suddenly Old Fags leaned forward in the dark room and said, "No, Mr. Meads, but you ought to play the game, you know. Oh, dear, yes." "What do you mean, Mr. Meads?" said that gentleman sharply. "Minnie Birtle, eh? You haven't mentioned Minnie Birtle yet," said Old Fags. "What the devil are you talking about?" said Meads drunkenly. "She's starving," said Old Fags. "Starving, wretched, alone with her old mother and your child. Oh, dear, yes, it's terrible." Meade's eyes flashed with a sullen frenzy, but fear was gnawing at his heart, and he felt more disposed to placate this mysterious old man than to quarrel with him. "I tell you I have no luck," he said after a pause. Old Fags looked at him gloomily and ordered some more gin. When it was brought, he said, "You ought to play the game, you know, Mr. Meads, after all. Luck? Oh, dear, oh, dear. Would you rather be the woman? 5 shillings a week, you know, would—" "No, I'm damned if I do," cried Meads fiercely. "It's all right for these women. God, how do I know if it's true? Look here, old bird, do you know I'm already done in for 2 5-bobs a week, eh? One up in Norfolk and the other in Enfield. 10 shillings a week of my money go to these blasted women. No fear, no more. I'm through with it." Oh, dear, said Old Fags, and he moved a little farther into the shadow of the room and watched the groom out of the depths of his sunken eyes. But Meade's courage was now fortified by the fumes of a large quantity of fiery alcohol, and he spoke witheringly of women in general and seemed disposed to quarrel if Old Fags disputed his right to place them in the position that Meade's considered their right and natural position. But Old Fags gave no evidence of taking up the challenge. On the contrary, he seemed to suddenly shift his ground. He grinned and leered and nodded at Meade's string of coarse sophistry, and suddenly he touched him on the arm and looked round the room and said very confidentially, "Oh, dear, yes, Mr. Meads. Don't take too much to heart what I said." And then he sniffed and whispered, "I could put you on to a very nice thing, Mr. Meads. I could introduce you to a lady I know would take a fancy to you, and you to her. Oh, dear, yes." Meads pricked up his ears like a fox terrier, and his small eyes glittered. "Oh," he said, "are you one of those, eh, old bird? Who is she?" Old Fags took out a piece of paper and fumbled with a pencil. He then wrote down a name and address somewhere at Shepherd's Bush. "What's a good time to call?" said Meads. "Between 6 and 7, answered Old Fags. "Oh, well," said Meads. "I can't do it. I've got to get back and take the dogs out at 5:30, old bird. From 5:30 to 6:30. The missus is back, and she'll kick up a hell of a row." Oh, dear, said Old Fags. "What a pity. The young lady is going away, too." He thought for a moment, and then an idea seemed to strike him. "Look here, would you like me to meet you and take the dogs round the park till you return?" "What?" said Meads. "Trust you with £1,000 worth of dogs? Not much." No, of course not. I hadn't thought of that," said Old Fags humbly. Meads looked at him, and it is very difficult to tell what it was about the old man that gave him a sudden feeling of complete trust. The ingenuity of his speech, the ingratiating confidence that a mixture of beer gin gives, tempered by the knowledge that famous pedigree Pekingese would be almost impossible to dispose of. Perhaps it was a combination of these motives. In any case, a riotous impulse drove him to fall in with Old Fags' suggestion, and he made the appointment for 5:30. Evening had fallen early, and a fine rain was driving in fitful gusts when the two met at the corner of Hyde Park. There were the 10 little dogs on their lead, and Meads with a cap pulled close over his eyes. Oh, dear, cried Old Fags as he approached. "What dear little dogs, what dear little dogs." Meads handed the lead over to Old Fags and asked more precise instructions of the way to get to the address. "What are you wearing that canvas sack inside your coat for, old bird, eh?" asked Meads when these instructions had been given. "Oh, my dear sir," said Old Fags, "if you had the asthma like I get it, and no underclothes on these damp days. Oh, dear. He wheezed drearily. Meade gave him 1 or 2 more exhortations about the extreme care and tact he was to observe. "Be very careful with that little chow on the left lead. He's got his coat on, see? He's had a chill, and you must keep him on the move. Gently, see?" Oh dear, poor little chap, what's his name?" said old Fags. "Peleus," answered Mr. Meads. "Oh, poor little Peleus. Come along, you won't be too long, Mr. Meads, will you?" "You bet I won't," said the groom, and nodding, he crossed the road rapidly, and mounting a shepherd's bush motor bus, he set out on his journey to an address that didn't exist. Old Fags ambled slowly around the park, snuffing and talking to the dogs. He gauged the time when Meads would be somewhere about Queen's Road. Then he ambled slowly back to the point from which he had started. With extreme care, he piloted the small army across the high road and led them in the direction of Paddington. He drifted with leisurely confidence through a maze of small streets. Several people stopped and looked at the dogs, and the boys barked and mimicked them. But nobody took the trouble to look at old Fags. At length he came to a district where their presence seemed more conspicuous. Rows of squalid houses and advertisement hoardings. He slightly increased his pace, and a very stout policeman standing outside a funeral furnisher's glanced at him with a vague suspicion. In strict accordance, however, with an ingrained officialism that hates to act without instructions, he let the cortege pass. Old Fags wandered through a wretched street that seemed entirely peopled by children. Several of them came up and followed the dogs. "Dear little dogs, aren't they? Oh, my, yes, dear little dogs," he said to the children. At last he reached a broad, gloomy thoroughfare with low, irregular buildings on one side and an interminable length of hoardings on the other, that screened a strip of land by the railway land that harbored a wilderness of tins and garbage. Old Fags led the dogs along by the hoarding. It was very dark. 3 children who had been following tired of the pastime and drifted away. He went along once more. There was a gap in a hoarding on which was notified that pilgrims' landaulettes could be hired for the evening at an inclusive fee of 2 guineas. Telephone 47901 Mayfair. The meager light from a street lamp 30 yards away revealed a colossal colored picture of a very beautiful young man and woman stepping out of a car and entering a gorgeous restaurant, having evidently just enjoyed the advantage of this peerless luxury. Old Fags went on another 40 yards and then returned. There was no one in sight. "Oh, dear little dogs," he said. Oh dear, what dear little dogs. Just through here, my pretty pets. Gentle, Peleus, gentle, very gently, there. Oh, what dear little dogs." He stumbled forward through the quagmire of desolation, picking his way, as though familiar with every inch of ground, to the further corner where it was even darker, and where the noise of shunting freight trains drowned every other murmur of the night. It was 8 o'clock when old Fags reached his room in Bolingbroke Buildings, carrying his heavy laden sack across his shoulders. The child in room 476 had been peevish and fretful all afternoon, and the 2 women were lying down exhausted. They heard old Fags come in. He seemed very busy, banging about with bottles and tins and alternately coughing and wheezing. But soon the potent aroma of onions reached their nostrils, and they knew he was preparing to keep his word. At 9 o'clock he staggered across with a steaming saucepan of hot stew. In contrast to the morning's conversation, which, though devoid of self-consciousness, had taken on at times an air of moribund analysis, making little stabs at fundamental things, the evening passed off on a note of almost joyous levity. The stew was extremely good to the starving women, and old Fags developed a vein of fantastic pleasantry. He talked unceasingly, sometimes on things they understood, sometimes on matters of which they were entirely ignorant. And sometimes he appeared to them obtuse, maudlin, and incoherent. Nevertheless, he brought to their room a certain light-hearted raillery that had never visited it before. No mention was made of Meads. The only blemish to the serenity of this bizarre supper was that old Fags developed intervals of violent coughing, intervals when he had to walk around the room and beat his chest. These fits had the unfortunate result of waking the baby. When this undesirable result had occurred for the 4th time, old Fags said, oh dear, this won't do. Oh no, this won't do. I must go back to my hotel." A remark that caused paroxysms of mirth to old Mrs. Birtle. Nevertheless, old Fags retired, and it was then just on 11 o'clock. The women went to bed, and all through the night Minnie heard the old man coughing. Meads jumped off the bus at Shepherd's Bush and hurried in the direction that old Fags had instructed him. He asked 3 people for the Pomeranian Road before an errand boy told him that he believed it was somewhere off Giles Avenue. But at Giles Avenue no one seemed to know it. He retraced his steps in a very bad temper and inquired again. 5 other people had never heard of it, so he went to a post office, and a young lady in charge informed him that there was no such road in the neighborhood. He tried other roads whose names vaguely resembled it, then he came to the conclusion that that blamed old fool had made some silly mistake. He took a bus back with a curious gnawing fear at the pit of his stomach, a fear that he kept thrusting back. He dare not allow himself to contemplate it. It was nearly 7:30 when he got back to Hyde Park, and his eye quickly scanned the length of railing near which Old Fags was to be. Immediately that he saw no sign of him or the little dogs, a horrible feeling of physical sickness assailed him. The whole truth flashed through his mind. He saw the fabric of his life crumble to dust. He was conscious of visions of past acts and misdeeds tumbling over each other in a furious kaleidoscope. The groom was terribly frightened. Mrs. Bastian Melland would be in at 8 o'clock to dinner, and the first thing she would ask for would be the little dogs. They were never supposed to go out after dark, but he had been busy that afternoon and arranged to take them out later. How was he to account for himself and their loss? He visualized himself in a dock, and all sorts of other horrid things coming up, a forged character, an affair in Norfolk, and another at Enfield, and a little trouble with a bookmaker 7 years ago. For he felt convinced that the little dogs had gone forever, and Old Fags with them. He cursed blindly in his soul at his foul luck, and the wretched inclination that had lured him to drink beer gin with the old thief. Forms of terrific vengeance passed through his mind, if he should meet the old devil again. In the meantime, what should he do? He had never even thought of making Old Fags give him any sort of address. He dared not go back to Hyde Park Square without the dogs. He ran breathlessly up and down, peering in every direction. 8 o'clock came, and there was still no sign. Suddenly he remembered Minnie Birtle. He remembered that the old ruffian had mentioned and seemed to know Minnie Birtle. It was a connection that he had hoped to have wiped out of his life, but the case was desperate. Curiously enough, during his desultory courtship of Minnie, he had never been to her home. The only occasion when he had visited it was after the birth of the child. He had done so under the influence of 3 pints of beer, and he hadn't the faintest recollection now of the number or the block. He hurried there, however, in feverish trepidation. Now Bolingbroke Buildings harbor some 800 people, and it is a remarkable fact that although the Birtles had lived there about a year, of the 11 people that Meads asked, not one happened to know the name. People develop a profound sense of self-concentration in Bolingbroke Buildings. Meads wandered up all the stairs and through the slate-tile passages. Twice he passed their door without knowing it. On the first occasion, only 5 minutes after Old Fags had carried a saucepan of steaming stew from number 475 to number 476. At 10 o'clock he gave it up. He had 4 shillings on him, and he adjourned to a small pub hard by, and ordered a tankard of ale, and as an afterthought 3 pennyworth of gin which he mixed in it. Probably he thought that this mixture, which was so directly responsible for the train of tragic circumstance that encompassed him, might continue to act in some manner toward a more desirable conclusion. It did indeed drive him to action of a sort, for he sat there drinking and smoking Navy-cut cigarettes, and by degrees he evolved a most engaging but impossible story of being lured to the river by 3 men and chloroformed, and when he came to, finding that the dogs and the men had gone. He drank a further quantity of beer gin, and rehearsed his role in detail, and at length brought himself to the point of facing Mrs. Melland. It was the most terrifying ordeal of his life. The servants frightened him for a start. They almost shrieked when they saw him and drew back. Mrs. Bastian Melland had left word that he was to go to a small breakfast room in the basement directly he came in, and she would come and see him. There was a small dinner party on that evening, and an agitated game of bridge. Meads had not stood on the hearthrug of the breakfast room 2 minutes before he heard the foreboding swish of skirts. The door burst open, and Mrs. Bastian Melland stood before him, a thing of penetrating perfumes, highlights, and trepidation. She just said, "Well," and fixed her hard, bright eyes on him. Meads launched forth into his impossible story, but he dared not look at her. He tried to gather together the pieces of the tale he had so carefully rehearsed in the pub, but he felt like some helpless bark at the mercy of a hostile battle fleet. The searchlight of Mrs. Melland's cruel eyes was concentrated on him, while a flotilla of small diamonds on her heaving bosom winked and glittered with a dangerous insolence. He was stumbling over a phrase about the effects of chloroform when he became aware that Mrs. Melland was not listening to the matter of his story. She was only concerned with the manner. Her lips were set, and her straining eyes insisted on catching his. He looked full at her and caught his breath and stopped. Mrs. Melland, still staring at him, was moving slowly to the door. A moment of panic seized him. He mumbled something and also moved toward the door. Mrs. Melland was first to grip the handle. Meads made a wild dive and seized her wrist, but Mrs. Bastian Melland came out of a hard-riding Yorkshire family. She did not lose her head. She struck him across the mouth with her flat hand, and as he reeled back, she opened the door and called to the servants. Suddenly, Meads remembered that the room had a French window onto the garden. He pushed her clumsily against the door and sprang across the room. He clutched wildly at the bolts while Mrs. Melland's voice was ringing out, "Catch that man! Hold him! Catch thief!" But before the other servants had had time to arrive, he managed to get through the door and to pull it after him. His hand was bleeding with cuts from broken glass, but he leapt the wall and got into the shadow of some shrubs 3 gardens away. He heard whistles blowing, and the dominant voice of Mrs. Melland directing a hue and cry. He rested some moments, then panic seized him, and he labored over another wall and found the passage of a semi-detached house. A servant opened a door and looked out and screamed. He struck her wildly and unreasonably on the shoulder, and rushed up some steps and got into a front garden. There was no one there, and he darted into the street and across the road. In a few minutes he was lost in a labyrinth of back streets and laughing hysterically to himself. He had 2 shillings and 8 pence on him. He spent 4 pence of this on whiskey, and then another 4 pence just before the pubs closed. He struggled vainly to formulate some definite plan of campaign. The only point that seemed terribly clear to him was that he must get away. He knew Mrs. Melland only too well. She would spare no trouble in hunting him down. She would exact the uttermost farthing. It meant jail and ruin. The obvious impediment to getting away was that he had no money and no friends. He had not sufficient strength of character to face a tramp life. He lived too long in the society of the pampered Pekingese. He loved comfort. Out of the simmering tumult of his soul grew a very definite passion, the passion of hate. He developed a vast, bitter, scorching hate for the person who had caused this ghastly climax to his unfortunate career. Old fags. He went over the whole incidents of the day again, rapidly recalling every phase of old fag's conversation and manner. What a blind fool he was not to have seen through the filthy old swine's game. But what had he done with the dogs? Sold the lot for £1, perhaps? The idea made Meads shiver. He slouched through the streets harboring his pariah-like lust. We will not attempt to record the psychologic changes that harassed the soul of Mr. Meads during the next 2 days and nights, the ugly passions that stirred him and beat their wings against the night, the tentative intuitions urging toward some vague new start, the various compromises he made with himself, his weakness and inconsistency that found him bereft of any quality other than the somber shadow of some ill-conceived revenge. We will only note that on the evening of the day we mention, he turned up at Bolingbroke Buildings. His face was haggard and drawn, his eyes bloodshot, and his clothes tattered and muddy. His appearance and demeanor were unfortunately not so alien to the general character of the Bolingbroke Buildings as to attract any particular attention, and he slunk like a wolf through the dreary passages and watched the people come and go. It was at about 9:45, when he was going along a passage in Block F, that he suddenly saw Minnie Birtle coming out of one door and go into another. His small eyes glittered, and he went on tiptoe. He waited till Minnie was quite silent in her room, and then he went stealthily to room 475. He tried the handle, and it gave. He opened the door and peered in. There was a cheap tin lamp guttering on a box that dimly revealed a room of repulsive wretchedness. The furniture seemed to mostly consist of bottles and rags, but in one corner on a mattress he beheld the grinning face of his enemy, old fags. Meads shut the door silently and stood with his back to it. "Oh," he said, "so here we are at last, old bird, eh?" This move was apparently a supremely successful dramatic coup, for old fags lay still, paralyzed with fear, no doubt. "So this is our little home, eh?" Meads continued, "where we bring little dogs and sell 'em. What have you got to say, you old—" The groom's face blazed into a sudden accumulated fury. He thrust his chin forward and let forth a volley of frightful and blasting oaths. But old fags didn't answer. His shiny face seemed to be intensely amused with this outburst. "We got to settle our little account, old bird, see?" And the suppressed fury of Meads' voice denoted some physical climax. "Why the hell don't you answer me?" He suddenly shrieked, and springing forward, he lashed old fags across the cheek. A terrible horror came over him. The cheek he had struck was as cold as marble, and the head fell a little impotently to one side. Trembling as though struck with an ague, the groom picked up the guttering lamp and held it close to the face of Old Fags. It was set in an impenetrable repose, the significance of which even the groom could not misunderstand. The features were calm and childlike, lit by a half-smile of splendid tolerance that seemed to have overridden the temporary buffets of a queer world. Meads had no idea how long he stood there gazing horror-struck at the face of his enemy. He only knew that he was presently conscious that Minnie Birtle was standing by his side, and as he looked at her, her gaze was fixed on Old Fags, and a tear was trickling down either cheek.
"He's dead," she said. "Old Fags is dead. He died this morning of pneumonia."
She said this quite simply, as though it was a statement that explained the wonder of her presence. She did not look at Meads or seem aware of him. He watched the flickering light from the lamp illuminating the underside of her chin and nostrils and her quivering brows.
"He's dead,"
she said again, and the statement seemed to come as an edict of dismissal, as though love and hatred and revenge had no place in these fundamental things. Meads looked from her to the tousled head, leaning slightly to one side on the mattress, and he felt himself in the presence of forces he could not comprehend. He put the lamp back quietly on the box and tiptoed from the room. End of Section 3. Old Fags.